St. Ignatius, Rules of Discernment, Rule 8. Consolation will soon return. This is a time for patience. I'd like to introduce Rule 8 with a passage from the spiritual journal of the servant of God, Frenchwoman Elizabeth Lesieur. Her biography I've put on this slide, just a brief biography, so if you want to read it, you're welcome to pause the video and just read the slide. But I'll tell you a little bit about her life before I read this passage. So Elizabeth and her husband had a lifelong happy marriage. Felix, however, was a militant atheist. His attacks on her Christian faith caused Elizabeth to explore that faith even more deeply, leading her to a deep life and union with the Lord and a faithful service to the Lord in her married life. Her one sorrow was that she could not share her life of faith with her husband. Elizabeth never pressured Felix, but simply lived her family life with all the love that she could. After Elizabeth's death, Felix found her spiritual journal, the existence of which he knew nothing of. As he read, he was struck to realize that there was a deep part of his wife's life that he never knew. Felix learned too from his wife's journal of her great longing that someday he would come to the faith in Christ. As he read, Felix's heart was changed. He embraced faith in Christ and was eventually ordained a Dominican priest and dedicated his life to sharing his wife's spiritual writings and message. And here we have a couple of journal entries of Elizabeth's diary. Cowardice, weakness, awkwardness in my demeanor with others, things that can harm the ideas I cherish, acute physical suffering and deep moral suffering. I'll just pause here. So what is it that Elizabeth is experiencing? Well, according to her writing, we can know that it is non-spiritual desolation through the acute physical sufferings. We know that that is one of the definite signs of non-spiritual desolation. As well, we can see this spiritual suffering. So a deep moral suffering suggests an interior suffering. Now note how Elizabeth responds to her spiritual desolation, and this is the very heart of Rule 8. She writes, "In the midst of this, a will unshakably turned to God, a plenitude of confidence in Him and love for Him, daily duties performed at whatever cost, by great effort, without fervor, but still performed." When the spiritual burden urges Elizabeth to give way, to give up and relax her efforts, she will not give up. She will stay the course. And if we can see, can sense, can feel this unshakable resolve of Elizabeth to stay the course in the time of spiritual desolation, then we have grasped Rule 8. Let us continue with Elizabeth's diary entry. Then, little by little, calm returning to me and divine strength penetrating me again, new and energetic resolutions, the hope that God will help me to do my duty, all my duty, that is the tale of these last weeks and of my soul during this time. Later in the journal, Elizabeth continues. We continue with Elizabeth's diary entry. More than 2 months in the dejection of almost continual physical suffering, and with terrible anxiety on Juliet's account, the miserable belief that my illness will last as long as I do, always impeding my life. Complete resignation, but without joy or any inner consolation. Now note how this wonderful woman of God responds to her spiritual desolation. The resolve to use my misfortunes for the good of souls, to fill my life with prayer, work, and charity, to maintain serenity through everything, to love more than ever those who are my dear companions in life. This is a really amazing response to spiritual desolation. Not only does Elizabeth stay the course when burdened by desolation, but she also resolves to use her misfortune for the good of souls, desiring that in the body of Christ, her burdens serve as the spiritual good of others. Elizabeth also resolves in the time of spiritual desolation to fill her life with prayer, work, and charity, and she strives to maintain serenity through everything. And not only this, but in the darkness of spiritual desolation, she also seeks to love more than ever those who are the dear companions of her life, that is, those of her family and others who are part of her life. And that super abundant application of Rule 8, to which we will turn in the next slide, in a time of spiritual desolation, that she will not give up, but with faithfulness stay the spiritual course. That is truly the whole essence of Rule 8. And here we will visit the actual text of Rule 8. And just another reminder that when St. Ignatius of Loyola talks about desolation in his rules, in the actual text of his rules, he is always referring to spiritual desolation. So again, the whole purpose of these rules is to speak to a person who is suffering from spiritual desolation. The 8th, let one who is in desolation work to be in patience, which is contrary to the vexations which come to him, and let him think that he will soon be consoled, diligently using the means against such desolation, as is said in the 6th rule. Okay, so St. Ignatius just talked about the 6th rule, so let's just do a little quick review. We're going to review Rule 6 and 7 and the principles of those rules, just to give us that refresher before we go forward. So Rule 6 are the spiritual tools to fight spiritual desolation. And what are those spiritual tools? Prayer, meditation, examination, and penance. And again, if you're just joining us now, but you haven't gone over these, we go into deep detail. If you visit our former Rule 6 video, which is posted, then you can certainly dive into all of these spiritual tools, which again are prayer, meditation, examination, and penance. And then Rule 7 is the importance of how we think. So things to consider. So visiting again those things to consider in Rule 7. So the first is that the Lord has left me in a trial. The second, so that we may resist. And the third is that he gives us the grace to resist. And again, this comes in more detail. If you visit the video on Rule 7, we go into great detail about those considerations. And so now we talk about working to be in patience and to be reminded that consolation is coming soon. So now that we've had that review, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into Rule 8, and we're going to pull out some key points and expand on those. So those are highlighted in purple, blue, and yellow, and I'll just really slow down when I read them over so that I can sink in just a little bit. The 8th, let one who is in desolation work to be in patience, which is contrary to the vexations which come to him, and let him think that he will soon be consoled, diligently using the means against such desolation, as is said in the 6th rule. So now let's go take apart each of these and really get a grasp on what Rule 8 is all about. And here we have the first highlighted part of the rule, work to be in patience. And patience comes from the Latin patior, to bear, to endure, to suffer. This is the virtue of the person who undergoes a trial and who does not flee, but remains constant and faithful, carrying the burden. Here Ignatius gives the key virtue, the key attitude needed in a time of spiritual desolation, that we work to be in patience, that, like Elizabeth, we strive not to give up, not to give in to the desolation, but to remain faithful to our spiritual course, that is, to our life of prayer and the service of the Lord in our vocation. Think of it like the marathon runner who continues to run the last miles when it would be so easy to give up, or the person who cares for a family member with a prolonged illness and who will, out of love, not desist from this service, even though the person, caregiver, might be tired or worn. Or perhaps the student who has taken several exams and still has more to take, who, though tired, continues to prepare for the remaining exams. Or the worker in the time of pressure to complete a project, who perseveres until it is finished. All of these people work to be in patience and faithfully stay the course. There are examples as well that can be related more to the spiritual life. So the woman who for a half an hour every day prays in the morning, and who today in a time of spiritual desolation would simply like to omit or at least shorten the time, and who does not, who completes the full time of prayer as planned. Or the man who is making a weekend retreat and finds himself in desolation. Maybe he would like to withdraw from the talks and the times of prayer or simply leave. But he persists. He does not. He continues to make the retreat as best as he is able. Or perhaps the married woman who has undertaken new efforts to love her family and who now, in a time of desolation, feels no energy or efforts to do this and simply wants to omit them and return to her earlier life when she's less loving and patient, but who sticks to the course, who faithfully does as best as she can to strive to maintain her new efforts in love. This is the key attitude in time of spiritual desolation, to work in patience, not to give up, but to stay faithful to our spiritual plan. The second highlighted part of the text, let him think that he will soon be consoled. The effort to work to be in patience in time of spiritual desolation is not simply a matter of willpower or sheer effort of the will. Obviously, some effort of the will is involved, but Ignatius immediately supplies help for this effort. The first of this is a thought. Let one who is in desolation think. And then he supplies us with what we should be thinking about, that he will soon be consoled. This is so helpful, this thought, in the time of spiritual desolation, because desolation, and that is the enemy speaking through the desolation, tries to have us to believe that it will always be this way. The desolation, or the enemy, claims power over the future and paints this present desolation for the man, let's say at 10 p.m., or the woman mid-afternoon, as we've seen in previous video slides, or any of us in desolation, as a condition that will last for the rest of today, tomorrow, next week, or 30 years from now. This will just go on and on and on in terms of the enemy. So the enemy wants us to believe that it will never end. But this is a lie. And it's also a lie that the desolation will be hard to resist. So right in the desolation, therefore, St. Ignatius urges us to call to mind, to think that we will soon be consoled. This thought contains three elements. We are to reflect that the present desolation will not last forever, that it will pass, that consolation will return. That is, a time will come when we will again experience consolation. And finally, that this consolation will return soon, much sooner than the desolation would have us believe. The contrast between this thought and the endless days, months, and years of burden presented to us by desolation is evident. The courage to work to be in patience, that is the thought that inspires us and is so evident in Rule 8. I'm going to use another example where there is a hospital room with 2 beds. In each is a patient, and each has different symptoms, but roughly the same physical discomfort. The doctor enters the room. He stops at the bed of the first patient and asks some questions and reviews the patient's chart. The doctor says to the patient, "I know that you're feeling some discomfort, and I wish I could tell you otherwise, but I need to tell you that you'll continue to feel this discomfort for several weeks yet." The doctor then approaches the second patient. Again, he asks questions and reviews the patient's chart. Then he says to the patient, "I know that you are feeling some discomfort, but I can tell you that by tomorrow you'll be feeling as good as new." And then the doctor leaves the room. How do you think these 2 patients react? These 2 who are experiencing roughly the same discomfort. Well, the first falls back on the bed and stares out the window. Then he picks up the remote control and flips mindlessly through channels. The long weeks of discomfort that lie ahead of him discourage him. He feels little energy for anything constructive. The second calls his wife immediately and plans for his return home. He also calls his boss, and they begin discussing a project which he will undertake when he's ready to go back to work. Already, thoughts turn creatively to this task. He moves about the room, packs his belongings, and he finds himself desiring exercise and walks into the corridor. He speaks cheerfully to those that he meets. Now, the doctor's words do not change the 2 patients' physical discomfort. The knowledge, however, that this discomfort will endure for a lengthy time or will soon pass changes everything. And our spiritual situation, when we're in desolation, St. Ignatius tells us that if we are like the second patient, if we, in a time of desolation, think and consider and call to mind this truth, that consolation will soon return, the spiritual desolation and discomfort of the present situation will become much easier to endure. Father Gallagher was sharing on our retreat a few years ago that he says when he senses that he is in desolation, he takes out his journal and he describes what he's feeling. Then, with Rule 8 in mind, he also adds, "This desolation will pass. There will come a time when I will read what I am writing now and will no longer be in desolation." And such is always the case, he said. When he wrote those words or writes those words, it is an act of hope, of trust in God's love. And the truth of St. Ignatius' Rule 8 comes to fruition. So that's a very hopeful thought for us too when we're in this time. The third highlighted part of the text, diligently using the means. So in Rule 8, St. Ignatius is actually referring, when he says the means, to those that are explored in Rule 6. And those 4, again, I know that I covered this in the review, but they are prayer, meditation, examination, and penance. And if this is new to you, if you're unaware of that, or you haven't visited Rule 6 yet, then I really invite you to go back to Rule 6 and to unpack each one of those means by which we can fight spiritual desolation. And again, this just shows how St. Ignatius means these rules to build on one another. So each one is a building block. Each one is a tool that we can put in our tool belt of spiritual help in times of spiritual desolation. So Again, I invite you to visit Rule 6 in our video series if you haven't yet. And if you have, then you already know what this is referring to by prayer, meditation, examination, and penance. If there's one thing that we can definitely see as we've been unpacking these rules of St. Ignatius and just going along and gathering tools within this process, we can see that alternations of spiritual consolation and desolation are normal in a person's spiritual life. So spiritual consolation does not last forever. It passes, and eventually we experience spiritual desolation. Neither does the desolation last forever. It too passes, and the spiritual consolation returns. At times, we have already said that we will experience neither spiritual consolation nor spiritual desolation, but rather a tranquil time. We can see that sort of illustrated in that picture, that sometimes it just kind of evens out when we serve God in an effective, calm space. The precise measure of these different spiritual experiences is always subjective. It's always, that's what makes us so unique and beautiful. It is shaped by God's loving providence in each life and by our readiness to cooperate with grace and to resist the enemy, to be discerning. And that experience that we journey in this spiritual life, it is normal. So the ups and the downs, and we can take rest in knowing that we are not alone in our spiritual fluctuations at times, that many great saints, as we've already heard stories of beautiful saints and servants of God that have went through this spiritual pattern, that it is not only normal, but it is part and parcel of our life, our spiritual journey with the Lord. And the more we learn, the more that we are able to gather these tools to effectively fight spiritual desolation, the more we will grow in confidence, in trust, in God's divine loving mercy. Congratulations, you've made it through Rule 8, and hopefully during this journey of going through the rules of St. Ignatius, that you've been able to gain some real insight and some tangible tools to work through your spiritual desolation. Or perhaps you have someone that you're helping out. Maybe this isn't applying to you right now. Maybe you're in a really good place of spiritual consolation, or just kind of on that even road spiritually, but you are been asked to help another person in their journey. So hopefully you can share that wisdom with them. The examples that I've taken throughout these videos come from Father Timothy Gallagher, and I've just sort of given you a snapshot of each rule, because if I was to go sort of page by page through his Discernment of Spirits book, the videos would be very, very lengthy. So I'm just kind of taking a snapshot and pulling out the pieces that I feel to be most important in teaching each rule. And I wanted to, again, show this book. I know that I've put this book at the beginning of the series, but if you are interested, or if you feel that God is calling you to a deeper look at each of these rules, and maybe you need some more examples and you need some more unpacking, then please feel free to get this book, The Discernment of Spirits by Father Timothy Gallagher. He, again, has many more examples to share of each rule, and has his own wisdom and his own way of just kind of unpacking these. And I thank you so much for joining thus far and learning a little bit more about Rule 8 in this spiritual journey. And I hope that you will continue in this series, and as we unroll Rule 9 and the subsequent rules, that you will be with us for the entire length of this study. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we invite you to check out the website for the Marian Devotional Movement, which is visitationproject.org. If you have any questions that you would like to discuss, or anything in this series, or anything that we've been covering in these videos, you're welcome to email me at colleen@themdm.org. On Thursday nights, we're doing a video series for women growing in faith. So in the fall of 2022, we'll be doing the Wild Goose series. That starts in September, so please join us for that if you're interested. And we also have our morning prayer time, so you're welcome again to visit the website. There's also going to be a link in the show notes that will take you directly to the MaryMartha page for women. You can sign up and get emails and just be part of our community. And I look forward to connecting with you soon. God bless.